What's going on, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. We're going to finish up Dreamland today. I know it only took me 7 months, but I'm glad you guys have stuck with me through this. It's kind of a longer chapter. We're going to start on page 324. Nobody can do it alone. By the way, I'm banned from YouTube right now. It's my last day in banishment. By the time you guys are hearing this, the last 2 episodes, I've had to put off 4 days because I was banned for so long. Again, for a chapter reading, I made a comment right in the middle of a chapter, and you may notice one of the chapters is now gone. That's the one I got a strike for. Got it 7 days ago. I got to wait till the end of the day today. So this is Nobody Can Do It Alone, page 324. Southern Ohio. On March 26, 2013, Dr. Philip Pryor died of liver cancer in a hospice in Lancaster, Ohio. He was 59. As a kid, Pryor had wanted to be a paleontologist, a herpetologist, an archaeologist, and a biologist. By the way, a herpetologist is someone who studies snakes. All before he was 10. He raised snakes. In open rebellion to his father, who was insisting he cut his hair, he went to the barber shop and got his head shaved. When his family's church urged blacks in its congregation to find their own church, Pryor walked through the corridors yelling that he would never step foot in it again. His parents prized education above all else. Pryor alarmed them by spending the first 7 years after high school getting a degree into auto mechanics and learning bicycle repair, and then opening a bike shop in Cincinnati. He finally entered college at 24, got a medical degree from Ohio State, and worked for many years as a family doctor in Chillicothe. Later, as a recovering alcoholic, Pryor turned to a specialty in addiction medicine. He lived on a farm in Stoutsville, Ohio. He built rockets for several years. He and 3 others held a world record in amateur rocketry, sending a homemade rocket 23 miles up in the air above White Sands, Nevada. He loved to hunt. A mountain lion he killed in Wyoming was mounted on his living room wall. His garage was a meeting place for men with zeal for auto mechanics. Real family doctors touch lots of people. 200 of Pryor's friends gathered to remember him a few days after his death. His kids chose to play the Beatles' Let It Be and Jimi Hendrix's The Wind Cries Mary as mourners comforted the family. At his farm, friends fired up a bronze Chevy van with mag wheels he was working on before he got sick. They met again months later for a hog roast at which his ashes were scattered on the farm. Some of the ashes were shot up into the sky in a homemade rocket, along with messages from friends. Pryor's life had been marbled by addiction, elevated by exploration, and studded by acts of defiance. He drove a simple Toyota Camry and owned a couple of suits that he rarely wore. But he had been lonely. He had been a lonely voice at America's opiate ground zero for his final half-dozen years, sounding the alarm about the excessive prescribing of OxyContin as a gateway to heroin. He was one of the first in the region to urge the use of medication in the treatment of addiction. The judicious use of Suboxone, particularly, feeling that abstinence too often led recovering addicts to relapse and, with low tolerance, to die when they did. I spoke with Pryor on the phone, but never in person. I intended to, but he grew ill. By the time I made it to Ohio, he was in hospice. There will only be a handful of us who will ever remember who Dr. Pryor is, but in southern Ohio, he is the crucial doc, said Orman Hall when we first met for lunch, coincidentally a few hours before Pryor died. Hall now directed the state's substance abuse program. Opiate addiction was everywhere in Ohio. I asked Hall how long he thought the country might be living with this generation of opiate addicts. Some Vietnam-era addicts were still using, hanging on 40 years later. Let's hope we can keep people alive, Hall said. Our experience is that people go from 0 to 60 pretty quickly. An Ohio State physics honor student, Hall, had been started out using 10 milligrams of Percocet recreationally every other day. 11 months later, he was mainlining a large amount of heroin daily. Philip Pryor, quote, was the guy who articulated the treatment approach we need to take to deal successfully with this population of opiate addicts, Hall said. He was the guy who painted the bigger picture of the complicity of Purdue Pharma in starting this epidemic. He was the guy who did it for me. The The profound irony in all of this is that opiates are providing him with some level of quality of life as he expires. Indeed, after years fighting prescription opiate abuse and the heroin addiction that followed, Phil Pryor, in the weeks before his death, was administered and grew dependent on the opiate painkillers that he received from hospice nurses to relieve his considerable pain. He even called a doctor to intervene when hospice nurses wouldn't up his dose. He's ending his life opiate dependent, Hall said. There's an appropriate role for opiates in our healthcare system, and how they're being used for Dr. Pryor is a prime example of how they need to be used. Miles north, in the town of Marion, Brad Belcher's guerrilla tactics had ignited a discussion. One person taken up in it was Jennifer Miller, Marion County's chief probation officer. By 2013, almost 80% of Miller's caseload was opiate addicts. Miller had begun her career in the mid-90s as a gung-ho officer who saw her job as locking up as many folks as she could. She wrote presenting reports that urged prison for pot smokers. But now a mother, and watching opiates take hold of her county, Miller noted how little success the old ways were having. Addicts went to prison, got out, and started using right away. "I've come a long way in opening my mind," she said when I spoke to her in 2014. A doctor at one seminar she attended described how opiates overwhelm the brain receptors. Miller began studying addiction and brain research online. She had never imagined this stuff would be necessary to do her job as a probation officer, but the opiate epidemic turned her into a social worker as much as a cop. In 2013, Governor John Kasich, a Republican, went around the Republican-dominated legislature and expanded Medicaid health insurance to every Ohioan, which in turn gave thousands of families a way to pay for long periods of outpatient drug treatment. The next year, Miller applied for a state grant to use the opiate-blocking drug Vivitrol on addicts. 4 months in, Miller had a waiting list for Vivitrol, and some of the county's worst junkies were clean. But each shot cost $1,200, and an addict needed it once a month. "The million-dollar question," Miller said, "is how long addicts will need to be on Vivitrol. So far, no drug company had stepped forward to help defray the cost. However, in Marion County, opiates and the Vivitrol experiment got police, jailers, court officials, and probation officers all working together in ways that hadn't been necessary or common before. Brad Belcher had inherited an old-school building that once held a rest home. He offered it 3 years rent-free for sober living house with dozen beds. So it seemed that the damaged county was rediscovering community. Some of the myths are being debunked, Belcher said. People are understanding that this is a chronic illness. People are complaining when people are shooting up in parking lots, but it ain't over." Down in Columbus, as the second anniversary of Matt Schoonover's death approached, Paul and Ellen felt the shock lifting. They tried to piece together their shattered lives by speaking publicly about how Matt died. That felt like therapy. Doing nothing, they thought, would have crushed them. They had known little about addiction when Matt was alive, so they learned about drugs in the brain, about mu receptors and endorphins, and that helped. Sharing grief publicly required taking care not to go too far in using it to push public awareness of the plague. Grief could become an occupation, but so many parents around the country were facing the loss of a child to this now. Strangers told them about addiction in their own lives. Ellen, in fact, felt she had suddenly been let in on a national secret. Addiction was everywhere. "People try to keep this happy facade," she said. "You realize there are a lot of people who suffer in silence." It soothed her to write occasional letters to Matt and to speak to parents with addicted kids on the topic. What I wish I had known. A main point, that after 3 weeks of rehab, no addicted child is fixed. In Ohio, opiate prescribing had declined 40%. The legislature had a roster of bills aimed at regulating prescription opiates and expanding treatment options. One of them was modeled on the counseling center, the treatment clinic run by Ed Hughes in Portsmouth. The bill required counties to provide addicts with a full range of services, from housing and psychological counseling to help finding work. Still, the state's problem raged. The Department of Health released numbers for the fatal drug overdoses in 2012. A record of 1,272 Ohioans had died that year, and of those, 680 were due to heroin. In one 3-month period, fully 11% of all Ohioans were prescribed opiates. Officials expected the number of heroin overdose deaths to more than double in the next couple of years. One way to view all that had happened was as some enormous social experiment to see how many Americans had the propensity for addiction. I ran this idea by an addiction specialist named Dr. Richard Whitney in the wealthy Columbus suburb of Dublin. "That's an interesting way to put it. Let's feed this to everybody in the society and see what pops up," he said. "Let's, as a society, watch all of our potential alcoholics become opiate addicts instead. Had these opiates not appeared, I think we'd have seen a similar number of alcoholics, but later in life. My field used to be middle-aged alcoholics. It usually took 20 years of drinking to get people in enough trouble to need treatment. But with the potency of these drugs, the average age has dropped 15 years, and the people get into trouble very quickly with oxycodone, hydrocodone, and heroin." Nationwide opiate addiction had achieved a few things, albeit at frightening costs. There was the remarkable change of heart regarding prison and treatment that was underway, especially in red states and led by Republican politicians. Parents seemed to be losing their fear. A PR consultant named Barbara Theodosio near Fort Lauderdale had 2 sons addicted amid the height of the Florida pill mill boom. Figuring there must be others like her, she started a website, addictsmom.com, and a Facebook page with the motto, quote, "Sharing without shame." By 2014, the page had grown to 14,000 mothers who consoled and prayed for each other as they wrote the rawest terms about collect calls from jail, $40,000 rehabs, syringes found in sofas, funerals planned, and their kids reaching 300 days clean of the morphine molecule. Theodosio added a page for grandparents raising their addicted kids' children. At times, the comments reached the pitch of a primal scream of maternal agony, a kind of mass group therapy for a drug epidemic in the virtual age. Quote, "For 6 long years I've begged, pleaded, screamed, yelled, cried, grounded, took things away, called the police, kicked him out, and not to mention the countless hours feeling guilty and terrified for him," one woman wrote about her heroin-addicted son who had just been thrown out of rehab again for failing a drug test. "And the thousands of dollars spent on rehab, hospital bills, and therapists, as well as bailing him out of jail, I have prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed." A deeper understanding was emerging of how addiction was created in the brain. Functional MRI scans had revealed a lot since the 1990s about the brain's pathways of reward. "It verified a lot of what we did intuitively," Whitney said. "Once people get addicted, they really lose the power of choice. It takes 30 to 90 days for the brain to heal enough to make decisions. Otherwise, it's like putting a cast on a broken bone and expecting someone to run 5 miles. Nationwide, attitudes towards addicts and addiction seemed to be shifting, though slowly. Addicts were not moral failures, deviants, and criminals, the image that stuck in the popular mind following the Harrison Act. Instead, they were coming to be seen as afflicted with a disease that happened to manifest itself in stealing and conning in the relentless search for dope to calm the beast. As I followed this story, I took as given that kicking opiate addiction required a dozen attempts at rehab. The figure I kept hearing was 1 in 10, the number of people who succeeded in each rehab. That was true, Whitney said, only because so few people get the full treatment they need. Too often they go in for 3 weeks or 6 weeks. Brain chemistry needs far more time to recover from the blast it takes from opiates. Quote, "We have as good or better treatment results as they do for asthma or congestive heart failure, if we have the tools to work with," he said. "But people do not get enough treatment to get well. It's as if we said, you only get half the chemotherapy you need to treat your cancer. People wouldn't stand for that. Insurance companies don't want to find addiction treatment with enough duration and intensity because we as a society do not demand it." Central Ohio was ground zero in the opiate scourge, and that had given folks a lot to think about. For Paul Schoonover, the best hour of the month was the time he spent sharing his son's story with kids at the rehab center that Matt left the day before he died. Paul was also working with the nascent college recovery movement at Ohio State. The movement began years ago in response to alcohol and pot abuse on college campuses. Rutgers, Brown, and Texas Tech pioneered the movement's hallmarks: dorms free of drugs and alcohol, 12-step meetings, counseling, drug-free social events, full scholarships for recovering addicts, majors in addiction therapy. But the movement gained huge momentum and spread to many more schools with the opiate scourge, and Ohio State was part of it. "It's been a white middle and upper class kids," a young woman said at Ohio State named Sarah Narad. "Their parents are the ones who are going to schools saying, 'What are you doing for my kid?' It really gets the attention of parents in schools when you have kids heavily addicted to opiates and heroin." Narad, a recovering heroin addict from Houston suburbs, was getting a master's degree at Ohio State University and had a grant to help start the movement on campus. The roster of universities with new recovery movements sounded like the top college football rankings and reflected how dope addiction had swept across red states. The Crimson Tide of Alabama and the Bulldogs of Georgia, Ole Miss of southern Mississippi, Baylor, Texas, Vanderbilt, Tennessee, Virginia, as well as Oregon, Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, and several smaller schools, all had campus recovery movements in response largely to pill and heroin abuse. Ohio State had opened a 28-room recovery dorm. Meanwhile, apart from expanding Medicaid, Governor Kasich had begun a program called Start Talking that was intended to bring the opiate epidemic into the public conversation. Attorney General Mike DeWine had a heroin initiative, a main goal of which was to connect disparate groups in Ohio towns and get them working together. These measures recognized a recurring theme: the most selfish drug fed on atomized communities. Isolation was now as endemic to wealthy suburbs as to the Rust Belt, and had been building for years. It was true about much of a country where the streets were barren on summer evenings and kids no longer played kick the can as parents watched from porches. That dreamland had been lost and replaced, all too often, finally, by empty streets of bigger, nicer houses hiding addiction that each family kept secret. Chronic pain was probably best treated not by one pill, but holistically. In the same way, the antidote to heroin wasn't so much naloxone as it was community. Paul Schoonover felt that. So when he wasn't speaking to kids at the rehab center, Paul spent his time connecting groups of parents, nonprofits, and schools, and talking about Matt. "Nobody can do it on their own," he said. "But no drug dealer nor cartel can stand against families, schools, churches, and communities united together." Hope you enjoyed the book, guys. Next, we're going to be reading The Untold History of the United States by Oliver Stone and Peter Kuznic. It's upstairs. This will be the last episode in this corner in my basement. My mother has had to move in here, so she's going to be living here, and I have to move upstairs, so I'll get to work on that today, and next time you see me, it'll be at a different corner of my house. Hope you enjoyed the book. It's 5 stars for me. Highly recommend you go out and actually buy it. It's worth having on your bookshelf. And if you have one and you've read it, hand it off to somebody that you think needs to read it. That's what I do with all books that I like, that I know I'm going to find other copies at Goodwill or the library. If I read a good book and I know there's somebody that needs to read it that's one of my friends or acquaintances, I just hand it off. So that's what I'm going to do with this. It's a 5-star book, Dreamland by Sam Quinones. Talk to you guys later.